You're listening to Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork, a podcast discussing the latest trends and technology in the food and supplement industries, featuring conversations with regulatory experts, quality and safety champions, and thought leaders across the industry. I'm your host, Lydia Adams. Let's jump right in. Welcome to another episode of Food Tech Talk. Today, we're joined by Rachel Zemser, a distinguished food science industry consultant with an impressive 28-year career that spans the full spectrum of product development, commercialization, and safety within the food industry. As the founder and food science technology consultant at Carte Connections, Rachel has leveraged her dual certifications as a food scientist and a culinary scientist to assist numerous food businesses, ranging from startups to large corporations. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
It's great to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited to hear more from you. I know we're all going to learn so much from you today. So kind of to get us started, could you share a bit about your journey in the food industry and what really inspired you to specialize in food science and product development?
I had a really interesting childhood. I grew up overseas. Between 1980 and 1990, I was not in this country. I lived in Africa, Israel, Spain. We traveled to a lot of places. And so at a very early age, I was exposed to not only different kinds of foods and cuisine, but also different kinds of packaged food products. You know, you go into a supermarket in Israel and the packaged products are not the same as what we had in the USA. So while I was getting ready to go to college, I almost randomly picked food science. I saw it as a list of majors and I thought it looked kind of fun. I didn't really understand it at the time, but I also didn't, because I was overseas, I didn't really get to visit any colleges either. So I just thought, that's fun. I know I'm going to UMass. They have a great food science department and I'm just going to give it a shot. And it just kind of all worked out from there. I started at UMass right in their food science department right from freshman year and continued on. I got my master's in food science and food microbiology. My first job was actually in fermentation R&D at Dan and Yogurt. And then after that, I did more food safety and challenge studies at Lipton. And I've basically been working as a food scientist all this time, but really as a consultant and contractor since 2009, helping startups and entrepreneurs. So that's kind of how it all came about and how I'm here today doing what I've always done.
Awesome. So kind of, getting into our main topics here, in your extensive experience with product development, what are the most critical steps in the R&D process? And how do you ensure that both innovation and safety are prioritized from the beginning?
As a developer, and that's kind of my main role in the food industry, is I help people develop and formulate their food products. There's a lot of creativity and ideation involved, and that's all fun and games, and that's the fun part. But really, there always has to be an idealistic evaluation of not only of what the product's going to be, but the process. How is that product going to be made? What is the process that it's going to be subjected to? How it's going to be packaged? How long it's going to last on the shelf? These are really the crucial parts that will dictate how the product is actually going to be formulated. So while the creative part is fun, coming up with ideas, working with marketing, the reality of creating food products is the manufacturing, production, storage, and processing. And that's going to have the higher priority. And that's really going to dictate how we go backwards and approach the creation of the food product.
Yeah, I bet that's kind of just like a marriage of, the ideas and the innovation, and then what's actually, what can we actually do? What can we actually make? And so how do you kind of navigate that process of creating something that's, like you said, fun and new, and then at the same time, this is a reality that we can actually have happen?
So, well, here's a pretty good example. For many years, I worked for a company that manufactured tomato sauces for restaurant chains, chains like Pizza Hut and Domino's and Taco Bell, salsas and so on. And those chains are usually headed up by an R&D chef who's come from the restaurant industry, and they have some really great ideas about how to make delicious tomato-based sauces. But unfortunately, in the real world, we have to cook the heck out of them. We have to pasteurize them and cook them pretty hot. So there's no gentle pasteurization or light pasteurization or cooking it lightly so the chunks fall apart in a certain way. We just have to cook it really, really hot as the process mandates that we do. So this is just an example of how, we usually have to have that conversation with the chefs and give them the reality check that they need to understand that, this is going to be shelf stable. It's going to be sold in the supermarket. It's never going to go bad because it's going to be sealed up. And unfortunately, to get it to that place, we have to basically practice the food safety methods that exist out there for these kinds of products.
So, what are some of the common pitfalls that you see that companies encounter when trying to integrate new ingredients into their products, and how can this be avoided?
New and novel ingredients. There's a lot of ingredients that everybody uses: sugar, salt, commodities, things like that. And those are usually not a problem. But every so often, clients want, well, actually, pretty often, they want to incorporate something that's going to give them a competitive edge. They want to use something from another country that's never been used before. They want to use a process that's never been used. And this is where they're going to run into trouble. Any new ingredient has to be evaluated to determine if we can indeed use it. And some of the questions include: is this ingredient readily available? Can we get as much of it as we need? Where is it coming from? What country is it coming from? And how are their food safety regulations, from the way that it's harvested to how it's processed to how it's delivered to the United States or wherever the final manufacturing places that it happens? And what are the rules over there versus the rules over here? And then, is this new ingredient safe to eat in large quantities, or is it something that is toxic at high levels? So everything from the safety of how it's processed to the safety of putting it in your mouth and eating it have to be considered. And manufacturers, they're always very concerned when brand new ingredients are. And when I say manufacturers, as a consultant, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs. They work with a lot of co-packers. So the co-packers are used to working with not just one company, but many small companies from all over the place. So they never know what's coming their way. But this is always a big, scary red flag for them. Like, oh, what is this new thing from the rainforest that they want to put in their product to give it the competitive edge? We have to really make sure that it passes all the inspections before we can accept it.
Yeah, and it kind of seems like that's where you come in to balance that creativity and compliance and making sure that all those boxes are checked, that yes, we can do this, and it's going to be fun, and it's going to be safe, and it's going to be a reality, right? As a
Yes,
consultant.
absolutely.
Kind of moving into nutrition. So, how do you approach the challenge of creating food that not only meets specific nutritional metrics, but then also maintains that consumer appeal for taste and texture? I think this is a really big one for a lot of people in the industry that are kind of striking that balance right now.
Yeah, this is something that I encounter all the time. It's a very tricky situation because entrepreneurs, startup companies, they really want to push the boundaries and they want to make something that hasn't been made before. And they want to meet specific nutritional metrics like high in fat or low in carb, excessively low in sugar. And they really want to push that envelope. So unfortunately, when you're formulating something, everything has to be balanced, not only for taste, but also for functionality. And, this is where I often have to have that reality conversation with the client. That I've had people ask me to put in 30 grams of protein into a 40-gram nutrition bar. And a nutrition bar is usually shelf stable and it's very dry. So it's not like it's going to be a wet, sticky thing that is going to be made. And 30 grams of powder in a 40-gram space is going to be too chalky and too powdery to eat. And that's just a fact that just can't be worked on. Like, there's no way to really get around that. And the same with sugar levels. If they want to go too low on the sugar, then it's not going to taste good. They're going to have to increase, the high intensity sweeteners like stevia and monk, and then you're going to have that aftertaste. So it's all about just kind of having that conversation and looking at the math. It all comes down to the math. If someone wants to put more protein in, I might have to recommend that they make the product itself a lot bigger. So then we have more space to work in. We'll still deliver 30 grams of protein, but now it's going to be in a 70-gram bar and not in a 40-gram bar. So now you've got more room for syrups and things to hold it all together, and other flavorings to make it palatable. So So yeah, so these are the kinds of issues that come up. People like to make keto products are very popular. If you put in too much fat, the product might get really greasy, and it might start, the fat might start liquidating out of the packaging material. That's definitely a problem with keto products. So it's very common, and it always comes down to a reality check. And there's always new and novel technologies that come out that can help us, get to better places. For example, there's actually a lot of fat powders that exist now. So if someone wants to make a powdered drink mix with fat in it, they can add a powdered fat, MCT, plated on a fiber, something like that. There's definitely ways to do it and new technologies, and that's why it's so important for consultants like me and all food scientists to always go to trade shows like IFT and supply side to make sure that we're up to date on technologies and ingredients so we can solve these expectation problems that come up pretty often.
You mentioned a couple of examples there with keto and all of that. I mean, have you had one where the desired nutritional profile kind of caused significant changes to the other aspects, or where you've had to kind of completely start over or scrap something because of these nutritional requests that they're asking for?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes if the client is adamant about getting to that goal, I'll go ahead and make prototypes so they can see, what they're in for, and that usually manages their expectations. But we've also had a lot of success in solving problems if the client's willing to be flexible about in other areas. So one good example is creating keto products. They have high amounts of fat. That's the whole kind of concept behind keto is high fat products, low carb, high fat, low sugar. And a fat that is liquid at room temperature, like a vegetable oil, that's not going to work very well in a shelf stable product. Olive oil, just other vegetable oils, coconut oil. But if the client's willing to use a cocoa butter or a palm fat, those are more solid at room temperature. Now, of course, they do have saturated fats in them. So there's like a nutritional trade-off there. But if that's not a concern, they just want to up their fat using palm, using cocoa butter. They're more solid at room temperature. They have a much higher melting point. They'll hold up better in a bar or in a powdered mix or something like that. So these are just some ways that we can kind of, work with what we have that exists out there.
And, kind of moving on to functional foods, and I know we've talked about, what that means, and you can share, what are some key considerations when incorporating those types of ingredients into your formulations? And, how do you reach that level of safety and efficacy with those types of ingredients and foods?
Functional foods, as I understand them to be, is are foods that have things like vitamins and electrolytes or omega-3 fats or plant extracts, turmeric extract. There's a lot of plant extracts and vitamins and things that are not necessarily things that the FDA has specific levels for, but or even has approved or reviewed, but people want to put them in the food because they have these benefits that may or may not be reviewed by the FDA. And we have to be really careful because a lot of times, and this mostly holds true in the supplement world, but now we're seeing a lot of foods that are becoming supplements, functional foods. We have to make sure that we're putting in an amount that is safe. How much potassium is acceptable? 4,700 milligrams is a daily serving of potassium, but that much potassium is not going to taste good. And, at some point you don't want to OD on these ingredients. So it's really important to know what is an appropriate amount to go into a food product. What is the DV, if it even exists? What is an unsafe level? What's a toxic level of this particular component? Do we even know? So these are all really important concerns. And of course, always a concern for any ingredient that's novel and new or that we haven't really used much before is where did it come from? And, how was it processed and the facility that it was processed in and just all of the safety scenarios that surround that, like where it comes from and where it's going to land and the regulations and so on, the cleanliness of it. Was it made in a facility with broken glass? Like who knows, where it came from. So yeah, these are all just big concerns with functional foods or foods that are becoming more like supplements, I guess, nutrition bars, where they're making them into brain bars.
Yeah, and like from a consumer perspective, they're like, "Oh, great, it has, this in it, it has that in it, it has protein, it has potassium, right?" But like that, like as you said, that's not as simple as just adding that in, because there's so many other factors to consider. As we think about scaling, because you mentioned, working with chefs and, having these fun ideas and novel ingredients, it feels like, transitioning from a kitchen prototype of making this thing, moving over to commercial production could be really challenging for your clients. So what strategies do you employ to ensure, that there's compliance, there's safety, there's the ability to scale up, when they're kind of going from that immediate idea of creating this new food, this recipe, onto mass production?
As a consultant, I do a lot of my work on the bench, but a big part of bringing a product to market is manufacturing it, of course. That's what it's all about. So, when I work with entrepreneurs and startups and smaller companies, big companies don't have the same concerns because they often have their own manufacturing plants, like Kraft and Unilever, they have their own plants and their own people inspecting. But co-packers are the ones that the entrepreneurs end up working with. And co-packers work with a lot of different kinds of products. They do a lot of different things. They're not always well versed in everything that comes their way. So the first and foremost important thing to consider is this the right co-packer for the job? He may say he can do it, but can they really do it? Do they have the right equipment in place? Do they have the right safety measures in place? So if you wanted to make a canned food, you really have to go to a retort facility that has safety experts in place, food processing authorities, people that understand, the safety risks of an anaerobic, low acid canned food. That's crucial. But even things like, dry blending or making capsules or supplements or anything really, it has to be something that they're used to doing and that they're comfortable doing and that they have the right safety team in place to know the risks that are going to come their way and how they're going to deal with those risks. So that's the first most important thing. The second thing is that, all co-packers have to be very carefully vetted and evaluated. And that means having audits and doing walkthroughs. I'm not an auditor. I'm not someone who audits manufacturing facilities, but I know where to find them and I know where to hire them. Now, often co-packers will say, "Oh, we have our third-party audit right here. You can just take a look at it." But I always recommend to my clients that they get their own. They have their own third-party person who is not connected to that co-packer in any way, but someone that you pay, you the client, because this is your product and you're the one, you need to make sure it's okay. That's just something that needs to be done, especially when working with co-packers that work with all kinds of different products or new co-packers. There's a lot of startup co-packers out there who are just new to bringing products to market and they don't have everything in place yet. They might offer a good deal. They might offer a cheaper price to produce, but it's never worth it in the end when you end up with product that you can't sell.
That seems like that's certainly the risk that you run by not choosing the right co-packer. Is there anything specifically that you've advised that they should look for when making that choice of a co-manufacturer, co-packer?
The number one question I get is, where do I find a co-packer? I can't find a co-packer. It's very hard to find one. When you do find one, you want to make sure that you have like a key contact who is there to work with you and your team, and they get back to you efficiently and quickly. They don't just ignore you or don't get back to you. They're willing to let you walk through the whole facility, like no secrets. Obviously they might not want to show you certain proprietary equipment if it's owned by, a big customer, but they should be able to walk you through the bulk of the facility so you feel like it looks clean. They should, certain things that even a novice can see is you can see if the allergens are sequestered off and labeled as allergens. And a very well-known food safety expert once told me, always go into their bathrooms, see how well their bathrooms are maintained. If their bathrooms are clean, spick and span, and everyone's wearing hair nets and everyone looks wearing their beard nets, you can get a good feeling about it. But if you see sloppy sanitation on the floor, you see people with their sleeves rolled up and hairy arms not being covered, beards not being covered, people without hair nets on or hair coming out, like that's never a good sign. It means that if they're sloppy in that area, they're going to be sloppy in other areas.
That is great advice. And you're not the first person who has mentioned the sanitation. So certainly something to look for. Let's talk a little bit about regulations. The regulatory landscape is always constantly evolving. We talk about it all the time. How do you stay ahead of these changes and ensure that your clients' products remain compliant? And then, while at the same time being able to push those boundaries for innovation?
When I think about regulation, it's all about the ingredients because finished products, have their own set of regulations, and those do evolve and change from time to time. But really, my bigger concern is more with the regulations surrounding ingredients and which ingredients are going to cause a problem. And it's really important that if they're going to work with a new ingredient, they have to make sure that it is going to exist in an adequate quantity. They may have to even find double suppliers for new and novel ingredients, like not just one, find two or three, because if you're ready to go to market and you're ready to start going into production, you need to make sure that there's just enough of that product to go around. And all manufacturers or good manufacturers in the United States are going to have a pretty intense compliance program for all of the incoming ingredients, and not just new and novel ones, but the regulations are always changing and being updated. So when I work with co-packers, I might think it's well and good for me just to say, hey, I want to work with this fiber powder guy. I met him at IFT. He seems cool. That's not enough. They're going to need about 50 pieces of paperwork to confirm that this particular supplier is going to be acceptable. So, a good rule of thumb is I try to work with co-packers. I try to work with ingredient companies that they've already approved because it's already gone through their vigorous process. But I also have to let the client know that if they're going to bring in something new from a brand new supplier, it's going to be subjected to all those vigorous regulations, and it may not pass. They may not be allowed to use that ingredient, not because there's anything wrong with it, but it just didn't have certain paperwork. They didn't have certain inspections done on their facility, on their end. They're not in compliance with the receiving co-packer. So making sure those two are in sync is crucial, that what is being delivered is going to actually be accepted. And that all goes back to sometimes you're going to have to maybe find a backup supplier because, this first one just didn't make the cut for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it seems like this would be, a pretty big issue for food startups, and it sounds like you work with a lot of those guys. So, do you have any kind of specific advice for startups about, navigating this regulatory environment in ingredients?
Well, first and foremost, I say let's try to work with what the co-packer has because they've already approved it. If they don't have it, and there's always many ingredients that the co-packer is not going to have that this client's going to want. I'm like, before we even start formulating with this, let's find out what the co-packer is going to expect, and let's make sure that supplier can meet those expectations. Because I don't even want to bother to formulate and create products until we know for sure that we're going to be able to use it down the road. So there's just a lot of thinking 10 steps ahead when it comes to R&D. You can't just do whatever you want, unfortunately. And the formulating in the lab, me getting on the bench and mixing and matching and making bars and tasting things, that's all fun, but so much has to go into before I can even get to that step. Every single ingredient has to be confirmed to be okay. I mean, with the exception of like maybe coconut oil and vegetable oils and sugar and salt, like the bare basics of commodities. Everything else, you just never know, like where it's going to be coming from, or if they're up to date on all of their paperwork.
And then in terms of consumer demand, we're seeing a lot of demand in the industry for clean, transparent, compliant labels. People want to know what's in their food. So, how do you ensure that the product formulations meet these consumer expectations, without compromising on safety or, shelf stability and also, again, pleasing the client who's actually making the product?
Yeah, I mean, clean label, it really does conflict with the important ingredients that are needed to make products function properly, be free of yeast and mold, and so on. So a lot of ingredients that are needed do not seem to be clean to the consumer, even if they are clean, even if they're natural. The client might not see it that way. They don't like the word. There's a lot of words that don't ring well. So it's hard. I've had people contact me and say, my product's becoming rancid. And I've tried the natural methods. Maybe it's like a nut bar or an oat bar that's becoming rancid. And I've tried all the natural methods, which are usually vitamin E, rosemary extract, working with the freshest, most possible ingredients. But, their product is still becoming rancid. And this is a quality issue. And no one wants to open up a bar and it smells rancid. They may have to resort to the less natural sounding preservatives that help with rancidity and oxidation, scavenging, and so on. And there's a lot out there. I mean, the food industry is very advanced. We have a lot of great technology, a lot of great ingredients, but a lot of them are man-made, but they work. So I often have to tell a client, you can go natural, but this could be the outcome. Another good example is inhibiting yeast and mold. Yeast and mold is not a safety issue. It's more of like a quality issue. No one wants to open up their cookie and see yeast and mold in there. Yeast and mold can be kept at bay naturally by keeping moisture out of the product. If you have a very, very, very low water activity, under 0.65, you're going to have a very dry cookie, like a cracker, and it's not going to get moldy, but it's not going to taste good. If someone wants to have a little more moisture in their product, then they're going to have to look at other preservative options. They might have to look at a sodium benzoate or a potassium sorbate. This is going to prevent the yeast and mold from growing in a product that has slightly high water activity. So that way the client doesn't have to sacrifice moisture and taste and deliciousness. They can have all that and their preservatives. But of course, a lot of the clients that come to me, they say, oh, I see that there are these wonderful, like chewy Chips Ahoy on the market and they have preservatives in them. And I want to make mine exactly the same, but without those preservatives. Well, then I have to say, well, Chips Ahoy actually had a pretty good team and they worked really hard to come up with this preservative system, and they're not doing it because they want to put preservatives in. This is the only way that they can do it at this time. But there's all kinds of natural inhibitors that are always emerging, like cultured dextroses and other natural antioxidants, like licorice extract is now an antioxidant that can help with rancidity. So there's always ways, but it just comes down to how well is it going to work? What is the appropriate level? And this is all the testing that has to be done. And the natural preservatives just don't always work as well as the man-made ones. They might be fine for the job, but we just have to test it out and find out. So there's always like that risk and that trade-off.
Definitely. And I know the natural desire for natural ingredients, I can read, I know what this is, it's very obvious, is, one of the trends for consumers. Are there any other trends that you're seeing, that you think are going to become a factor in the coming years in terms of formulating these types of products?
In addition to clean label, organic, locally grown, these are all wonderful marketing words that people like to see. Another big one that is being talked about quite a bit is the anti-ultra processed trend. Well, I'm hearing that word everywhere. Oh, this is an ultra processed food. This is why we're all getting cancer now. This is ultra processed. This is why we can't digest our food properly. There's a lot of misinformation out there surrounding ultra processed, and people then come to the consultants like me and they say, oh, I don't want my product to be ultra processed. And what does that even mean? There's no real specific definition of ultra processed. I mean, if you cook something on the stove, you're processing it. If you dehydrate something, you're processing it. If you want something shelf stable, it's going to have to be processed in some way, shape, or form. If you want something that's not ultra processed, just eat refrigerated foods only. And those are going to be more natural, and because they're going to have that refrigeration to protect it from bacterial growth and rancidity and things like that.
Moving on to technology, it's obviously revolutionizing, many aspects of food safety, formulation, recipes, all of that. So what are some of the most impactful technological advancements that you've seen, specifically within processing technologies, that you feel like are really going to change the game?
Just sort of in my career over the last 15, 20 years, I have always been very impressed with the HPP technology, which stands for high pressure processing. And high pressure processing is fun and it's exciting because it allows us to extend the shelf life of beverages and other products by using pressure to essentially like crushes the bacteria. It kills the bacteria by crushing, not by heat. So you don't have the negative attributes that heat brings to the table. So orange juice. Pasteurized orange juice has a certain taste. It's fine. We're all used to it. We mostly drink pasteurized, but it's got nothing on the fresh squeeze that you get at the restaurant when they squeeze it for you. Well, HPP will make a a orange juice tastes like it's been fresh squeezed, but yet it can still last in the refrigerator. People think HPP makes it shelf stable, but you still have to refrigerate your HPP products. It'll allow that fresh squeezed orange juice, or the more popular one that people like to have is coconut water. Coconut water pasteurized doesn't taste anything like coconut water fresh. HPP coconut water has a really fresh, delicious taste, like it's coming right out of the coconut, and it's shelf stable and it'll last in the refrigerator for several weeks, maybe 30 days. So I think that's a pretty exciting technology, and it's been around for a while, but it's one of the newer ones. Like, it didn't exist. I don't really remember seeing HPP products like 25 years ago. The technology might have been there, but now it's really more mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was kind of thinking about, if you are trying to create a product and, you've formulated it to these specifications and you've added all this stuff, like, how do you keep track of those ingredients and what you've changed out? And if you're continuously kind of like formulating, how are you just keeping all of that data? It seems like that'd be a lot of data.
So what most people do, most food scientists like me, is we formulate using spreadsheets. And I don't know how they did it, like, before spreadsheets. Like, I just always wonder, like, how were products created and before spreadsheets existed? Because I will, line up all my ingredients. I put in all the percentages. I also keep track of all my nutritionals in a spreadsheet, so I can see as I'm tweaking it, oh, like, I just dropped my sugar by a gram, I just increased my fiber. And this is really, the standard way. And then anytime I make a change, I don't delete, I just create like a whole new tab. So that next tab is and any developer that is listening to this, they probably all do things similar to me, but entrepreneurs, they don't really understand how I keep track, and usually I'll be able to share the spreadsheet with them, and they can kind of see where we started and where we've come to, and I try to keep track of everything. I try to keep track of the nutritional information within each ingredient and how that's affecting the overall product. And then, of course, there's software like like Genesis nutritional software. And after you're done with your formula, you can plug it into something like that to spit out your nutritional panel. So there's a lot of tools that the food scientists can use to keep track of everything. But it is a lot, and everything has to be noted and written down and weighed out in grams and percentages. We don't do anything in cups or tablespoons. So yeah, everything's just kept track of, usually with a spreadsheet, or in bigger companies, they probably have internal systems that they use to keep track of all of their formulas, so nothing is lost or goes missing.
Okay. And, just looking forward, what do you see as the next big challenge or opportunity in the food industry in terms of safety, compliance, formulation, and how should companies prepare to address these challenges?
I think a lot about this, about what's coming down the pike, what are our future challenges going to be. And there's many. The world is getting smaller, things are being moved from one place to another, and I think we are continuing to monitor and keep track of the movement. I know that I've heard that the blockchain, like Bitcoin, where the Bitcoin is also a place where we can help keep track of all of our ingredients and where things are moving to and from, like where it started and where it landed. And it's all going to be on the blockchain eventually. I don't quite understand like how it's all going to work, but I kind of get it. And I think that's going to help. So that's one big challenge. Another challenge is, and this is kind of a huge one, is just the delivering of all the misinformation that's out there. And there are so many blogs and people who are not food science informed. They're not informed on the rules and the regulations or what's real. And they just throw out all kinds of fake news about food. And they say whatever they want to say, usually to get people to buy whatever it is that they're pushing on their website. They might say, oh, you really shouldn't eat gluten, even if you're not a celiac, because it's going to make you sick all the time. You should buy all my gluten-free products, and they'll have links to them all. And this is huge. There's bloggers, and there's YouTube, people who speak on YouTube about all kinds of, doctors. Doctors are great, but they're not food scientists. They don't always get things right. They just have their own opinion and their own anecdotal information to pull from. It's not always science-based, even though it should be. So this is definitely a big challenge. And I think that consultants, I think the role that a consultant like me would play is, I don't I'm not owned by any company like Kraft, Unilever. No one can tell me what I can and cannot say out there in the world of the internet. And it's kind of up to these consultants to speak their mind and to say what's true. Because someone who works for a large company, they may not have that freedom. They may know it. Someone from Kraft Foods may be reading these blogs and saying, this is such nonsense, but they're not going to start posting under the Kraft name, because then it's going to be associated with Kraft's point of view. But the consultants like me, we're the ones that kind of have to fight this misinformation that's going on out there. It's up to us.
Thank you so much for sharing everything you have so far. I think I just have one more question for you. Coming from all of your experience, what advice would you give to your younger self or to anyone who's kind of starting off in this industry?
I work with a lot of interns. I have a lot of interns and assistants that come through my lab, and I like to give them lots of guidance and advice. And, so one of the key things I tell them is talk to everybody who you meet in the food industry. If you go to a networking event and you see the 90-year-old guy in the corner that is just sort of hanging out on his own, find out what he did and what his background and history was, and get whatever you can from him, because they have lots of knowledge. Anytime you go anywhere, just ask questions and learn, because you never know that person that you meet, at that networking party that you went to is going to be the person that you're going to be calling next month to help you solve like a food safety problem. You're like, oh yeah, I met that guy. He was a total expert in this or that technology, and now this has come up. I found his business card. I'm going to give him a call and see if, he remembers me. This always happens. The people who have helped me the most are the ones I just met in passing. So, always just build those strong relationships with anyone and everyone that you connect with in your field, and, whatever that may be, food safety, R&D, development.
That is excellent advice. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us and sharing all this knowledge. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, it's been fun.
All right. And thanks to our listeners. We'll see you next time on Food Tech Talk. Thank you for joining us for another bite-sized nugget of Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork. To learn more about Trustwell and its technology platform that connects product formulation, nutrition analysis, and compliant labeling with traceability, recall readiness, and supply chain transparency, please visit www.trustwell.com. Thanks for listening.